Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another week. Today we're going to start the civil rights movement. We're going to go over some of the beginning ideas of this movement in terms of how it starts, where people's ideas about African American equal rights, when through the entirety of U.S. history up until this point, African Americans have been treated like second-class citizens. So the question you always have to ask, why now and why this time? All right, so we're going to take a look at those beginnings, and we're going to move forward also looking at some of the key events at the beginning of the civil rights movement, before the 1960s, that go into challenging some of the norms that have existed in the country when it comes to race relations. So without further ado, I want to continue forward here and look at this idea moving forward. All right, so now this is chapter 21 in your textbooks. Obviously, you're not going to need your books for this, but there'll be some other assignments I'll give you here in regards to these ideas. But I'm going to post these notes. I also post the outline if you want them as well, so you can see that information up on Canvas. So you have the notes here. You can follow along to make sure you can take your own information, and I'll probably post some videos as well in regards to the events that you're seeing. All right. So the rise of African influence in culture. Obviously, it starts after World War II, and many African Americans thought it was time for the nation to live up its creed. After the 1920s, when African Americans contributed jazz music and other factors, and then also look at World War II, where African Americans served just as well as other soldiers in this war. It's time for the United States to live up to its creed that all men are created equal. Period. It's up to the country to make this change. All right, and there's several factors that lead into this. The first big one that gave people kind of, at least African Americans, all the hope, even though this wasn't the political intention of this, but it changed the world forever, was Jackie Robinson's initiation into Major League Baseball. From the Negro Leagues to the Major Leagues, Jackie Robinson came in and he had the expectation not only just to play good baseball, but also to essentially take a look at what people were dishing out at him and not throwing it back. Because if he got, like say, if someone punched him and he punched back, they would have blamed him. All these different things were going to be used. And again, there's probably a lot of that goes around today, but Jackie Robinson was under the most scrutiny at this point. And if you've ever watched the movie 42, you can see how, the character that played Jackie Robinson really struggled with that. And he did a really great job explaining that. But I'll put a video up of Jackie Robinson's initiation into baseball if you need that refresher, so you can see that. Probably a little documentary you'll be able to watch to look at Jackie Robinson's upbringing here. All right, but then if you look at other factors, and again, if you watch the videos from last week, you can see that Americans dealt with a lot of positivity after World War II. But the problem was a lot of that positivity was only accessible to white Americans. Many African Americans did not have the opportunities that all white Americans had, or at least enjoyed after World War II, like the suburban home, like other factors as well, the white collar job, TV, all these different things. They didn't see themselves on television. They didn't see themselves in movies. So there are a lot of factors that played a role into seeing this new change. So other factors look at, the migration of African Americans. When they moved to northern cities, they gained political influence. They are offered votes for social gains. Politicians would target their communities to get votes, and then as a result, the African American community would gain positively by that person getting elected. All right. The New Deal is another one, where FDR really catered to these votes to help gain federal jobs for African Americans. Now, FDR did not do everything. He couldn't do everything that was asked for by African Americans because obviously he had other constituents or voters to cater to as well. But FDR is one of the first progressive presidents that really helped to cater to African American ideals. All right. Then we have World War II. African Americans proved they could fight in battle just as effectively as their white counterparts, including the Tuskegee Airmen. Their name is the Red Tails. Again, a great movie came out about the Red Tails probably 5 years ago or less, looking at the experiences of those pilots, what they dealt with, how they exceeded expectations, and how they were able to still fly in combat. And then finally, the NAACP using the courts to challenge the segregation laws, segregation in schools, segregation in restaurants. Anything that could be challenged was challenged. Oftentimes it was unsuccessful, but then there were several other cases that were brought forth that were. All right, one of those cases is the Brown v. Board of Education. We left off this topic with race relations in the United States. We left off with Jim Crow, looking at the court decision known as Plessy versus Ferguson, which is known as our separate but equal case, saying that you can create separate facilities as long as they are equal to the races. This court case challenged that ruling. And the Supreme Court ruled in the end that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place whatsoever. So at the end, schools must desegregate. Everywhere in the entire country, every school must desegregate, meaning schools that are meant for white children must be able, for those within the district, within that area, must be allowed to cater to African American students as well. However, the reaction to this was not there. African Americans obviously rejoiced, but the rest of the country, which made up a majority of the population, they were kind of apprehensive about it. Most whites obviously may not have agreed with the decision, but accepted it, because it's a Supreme Court using the Constitution. Many Southern whites were extremely angry. This whole idea of being slaves and other factors as well. This did not, cater too well with people in the South. That was slavery when it existed, and then slavery was abolished. They created the Jim Crow system to keep African Americans, quote, in their place. And now with this, this allowed African American students to get the same education, which puts them on an even playing field, which means that in multiple facets of life, African Americans were going to be allowed in. Southern whites did not like that. All right, so that was the whole big transition that many Southern whites wanted to keep African Americans in their place. Many congressmen disagreed as well. That when it comes to education, they disagreed with this. They call it the Southern Manifesto, where many Southern congressmen and senators, they went through and said the Constitution does not mention education whatsoever, and neither does the 14th Amendment. Yes, equal treatment under the law, but education is not under the law. So, technically, the congressmen were right, but the Supreme Court had made the decision when it came down to public places, which is not in the Constitution as well. So they wanted to see one side of the argument, but not the other. So this is where we looked at the reaction to the Brown v. Board of Education. Now, if we move forward to see this in reaction, we call Little Rock, Arkansas into our idea here. So Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, when this law is passed, he refused to allow integration in schools, pretty much because if he did, the white majority of people in Arkansas would have voted him out of office. So many of these governors who are, knew they'd have to follow the law, many of them, did not care to, because they knew if they attempted to follow the law, they would be run out of town and not elected again. All right. So when 9 students from the all-colored school in Little Rock decided to integrate, to exercise that legal right they had based on the decision of the Supreme Court, Governor Faubus told the National Guard soldiers to turn away these 9 black students who wanted to enter Little Rock Central High School, having no reason, saying, nope, you're not allowed in. No reason whatsoever were these students to be allowed in. And he had no explanation. He had no evidence. He had no legal, matter or legal, background for his, reasoning as to why to keep these students out. This resistance causes President Dwight Eisenhower, who is now President of the United States, after the war being over, he was, the next person for the job because of his popularity as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces during World War II. He now sends federal troops, the 101st Airborne Division, in the school to escort these students day in, day out. And I'll put a documentary about the experience of these 9 students, which you can see linked there. I'll put the video up on Canvas. All right, but these 9 students were known as the Little Rock 9, and their experiences definitely were there. Like, they were harassed every day. They were not welcomed. But these students continue to persevere. And if you think your school is tough now in terms of your social standings, try being these kids and what they had to go through. So something to keep in mind. All right. Next thing that we see before the 1960s that changes everything, it really creates a spark for the civil rights movement from a standpoint of organization, is the Montgomery bus boycott. As you can see pictured in the lower sections of the slide, it all starts with Rosa Parks. All right. In Montgomery, Alabama, she was a seamstress, and she refused to give her seat in the white section of the bus up. She sat in the front, she refused, and she was arrested. You can see her mugshot down there in the bottom. And she was charged with violating segregation laws, a bogus charge at the time. She knew it, but many people were given that task as well to say you have to follow these laws. All right. But this boycott continues and is led by Martin Luther King Jr., who was a minister in Montgomery Church. And literally his church is blocks away from the state capital of Alabama in Montgomery. He can walk 5 minutes to the state capitol from his church, and he becomes a spokesperson for this. He calls for a boycott, meaning to refuse the bus system or use bicycles or walk to their work in the city. African Americans made up a majority of the bus users because, again, African Americans disproportionately did not have cars. So they used the bus systems. Well, as a result of Rosa Parks' arrest and Martin Luther King's guidance, they decided to have this bus boycott. It lasted 381 days. The Supreme Court hears it and rules bus segregation unconstitutional. So as a result, we see the major shift in ideologies that segregation in schools and now on buses is illegal. But before the Supreme Court even ruled that, the buses decided to desegregate themselves. The company itself decided to desegregate because African Americans making up the most of the riders, they couldn't afford to prevent or have these African Americans not use the buses. So they made all the buses desegregated, and you could sit anywhere on the bus at any time you wanted to, and they got what they wanted because of this nonviolent protest. All right, Rosa Parks sitting in her seat, getting arrested, bringing light to the lack of fairness in this particular idea, in this particular law. All right. And there's other segregations that we'll talk about here when we look at that exist throughout the country at this point, but we look at Mexican and Native Americans. If we get to it this year, I'll try to show you some of the Mexican American movements with Cesar Chavez and some of the Native American movements as well. But they were also segregated in schools and also won lawsuits. But unfortunately for Native Americans, who in my opinion should be the natural citizens of this country, but are now treated like third-class citizens essentially, they were forced to live on government-run reservations in extreme poverty while their entire communities were segregated. Not just the schools or the public places or the buses, but their entire communities. They were forced off their lands and forced to live on reservations. All right? And when the government tried to terminate the reservations, many people in the public were against it. So their termination failed. So you can really see that Americans have had a very difficult time ending a status quo that has worked in their favor, especially white Americans. So that's where we really begin to see major changes here. And this is before we even get any sort of legislation, and we begin to see changes happen because of nonviolent protests. And we're just scratching the surface here. So I'm going to post this video and go through it, follow the notes, take notes on it. I'll post other videos that go with it. There'll probably be some assignments as well that'll ask you some questions. All right? Okay, everyone have a great week and enjoy. Let me get this down here so you can see that. Enjoy your week and do the assignments as best as your abilities. Thank you very much.